The penultimate college football rankings have dropped, and as expected, Rivalry Week has certainly shaken things up big time. I'm Marisa Flores, joined by Stan Becton, and we're here to break it all down. From a new look in the top four to a dramatic shift in the bubble, there is plenty to unpack, with Selection Day being just days away, so let's dive right in. All right, Stan, Oregon still is holding strong at number one. Texas, they jumped to number two after their win over Texas A&M. Penn State and Notre Dame, they round out the top four with Georgia at number five. So let's start with the Buckeyes, though. That's the main topic of the week. Ohio State, they fell to number six after their loss to Michigan, but they still, hold on to that spot ahead of Tennessee. How do you think the committee sort of came to that decision?
Well, when you look at it and look at the resumes, I think that Ohio State just has the better resume over Tennessee, even though they're similar. Because if you look at the losses, of course, Ohio State lost to a Michigan team that has 6 wins, but Tennessee lost to an Arkansas team that also has 6 wins. And then when you look at the other loss, Ohio State lost to an Oregon team that's ranked number one, and then Tennessee, they lost to a Georgia team that's not even ranked in the top four. So when you look at it that way, the losses, Ohio State has the better losses, kind of. When you look at the wins, Tennessee's best win is against Alabama, who is ranked outside of the top 10. And then Ohio State has two top 10 wins over Penn State and Indiana. So when you compare the resumes, Ohio State has the better resume.
Certainly. I think a lot of these upsets that happened over the regular season, too, certainly took us for a turn that we weren't expecting. And then there's Notre Dame, since that week two loss, speaking of upsets, to Northern Illinois. They've outscored opponents, though, since then 441 to 134, which is pretty dominant, I'd say, though they do lack a conference title game. So then there's Tennessee, who, like you mentioned, they're at number seven, but after finishing strong, they also lack that title game. So do you think Tennessee's resume stacks up enough to hold this spot, or can they be jumped over?
I think when it comes to the rankings, if SMU adds another ranked win, they could move above Tennessee there. When it comes to that seed line, I think it could be a little harder for any team to move up based off what the committee chair was saying in that interview right afterwards. But I think for right now, we have to think things will stay as they are if the team is not playing.
All right, we'll see if they'll stay as they are, Stan. Now, moving on, let's talk about bubble teams because this is where it gets a little interesting. Alabama's holding on to that final at large spot at number 11. Miami, meanwhile, they took a big hit and they fell 6 spots to number 12 after their loss to Syracuse, of course. But how about South Carolina? They're at number 14 and somewhat they're looking like a dark horse for that final spot. Do you think they have a real shot or is there just too much to overcome now?
I think for a South Carolina team, it's a lot for them to overcome just because they would have to move past two teams. Even if you look at, who wins a conference championship, say they have a win over an ACC championship team. I think even with that, say Clemson wins and Georgia wins. Now Alabama and Ole Miss have wins over conference champions as well. I think it's just a lot. I don't know. It might be too much for them. But then you look at a team like Miami, I think they might have a shot still. It could be complicated. I think you would need a Georgia to get like blown out. But even if Georgia gets blown out, then you have a Georgia team that still beat the team earlier in the season that they got blown out to. So who knows? It could get crazy.
A lot can shake up, Stan, and it all kind of comes down to this weekend's conference championships. Oregon is going to face Penn State in the Big Ten title game. Texas and Georgia, they're going to meet again in the SEC championship. So let's talk about those implications. With the Big Ten, what happens if Oregon wins?
I think if Oregon wins, they're going to be the number one team. And then Penn State, it determines whether or not they host a home game because a Penn State team that loses, depending how they lose, they probably fall below an Ohio State who has a head-to-head advantage. And then does Penn State fall below a team like Tennessee? Do they fall below a team like Indiana who would have fewer losses than the Nittany Lions? So that's up in the air.
Does it lock up the number one overall seed for them, or what about Penn State?
I think whoever wins that game should be the number one overall seed because if Penn State wins, that means they beat the number one team. I think if you beat the number one team, you should be the number one team. And then if Oregon wins, they're undefeated.
How would a win impact their position, you think, in the final rankings?
In the final rankings, I think Oregon can't fall lower than two. I don't think if Oregon loses, they can't fall lower than 2 because if they lose to a team that in this case would only have one loss and it's a I don't think Oregon gets blown out. So I think Oregon can't fall below 2.
Well, if the committee has shown us anything, Stan, it's never say never, never say never. Now, looking at the SEC, if Georgia loses to Texas, where could the Bulldogs land in the final rankings? And do they still hold on to a first round spot?
I think if Georgia loses to Texas, they should hold on to a first round spot because I think against Tennessee, they beat Tennessee head to head. So I think they should be above Tennessee. But then you have the contrary side where if Georgia loses, they have 3 losses. So now, should they be above a 3-loss Alabama team? I think Alabama fans will be like, we beat this team. They should be ranked below us. So that'll come into conversation as well, depending how that game goes. I think a lot has to be determined with the committee. They always say that eye test. So how it looks when they lose. If it's another like, what was that, 8 overtimes against Georgia Tech that Georgia had? If it's a game like that, I think there's going to be little movement. But if it's one of those blowout games, I think you could see a lot change.
Wasn't sure if any of us were expecting 8 overtimes. Hopefully, you didn't have any planned Saturday night, Stan. And then there's the ACC championship. SMU, they're looking solid, but a loss to Clemson can shake this whole thing up even more. Could SMU still make the cut with a loss?
That's where the biggest question comes for a lot of these teams. Will SMU make the cut with a loss? I think if you lose a conference championship game like that, you should be in. I think that might not be the case, though. I think if an SMU loses, they might be on the outside looking in because they also have a loss to a BYU team that is way down in the rankings now compared to earlier in the season. So that loss doesn't look the same. It doesn't hold the same amount of weight as it did before. And then you look at the teams they beat, it might not stack up to some of those other teams on the bubble.
So much has happened this regular season, and it's not over yet. We still have one more ranking to look forward to. To wrap this up, though, Stan, I'm going to hit you with a little bit of a rapid fire. So you have 15 seconds or less to answer these questions I'm going to give you. Are you ready?
Okay, yes, I'm ready.
Okay. First off, which team outside the top 4 seeds has the best chance to crash the bye spots?
I think you look at a team like Arizona State, who's on a roll right now, especially if UNLV wins.
Okay, that was quick. Good job. Can Miami do anything to jump back into the field if Clemson beats SMU?
I don't think Miami can do much here. I think Miami's pretty much on the outside looking in. I know all my friends who go there, even my sister who graduated from there, they might not like hearing that.
All right, hopefully she's not watching. If Boise State loses the Mountain West title game, will the committee penalize them for playing while others sit out?
That's an interesting question. I think the committee will, only because they play in the Mountain West, and the committee has shown that if you're not in one of those ACC, Big 12, Big 10, SEC, they don't hold your schedule and strength of schedule the same.
Okay, that was for our first rapid fire. You did great. I wasn't even keeping track of time, but I know those were 15 seconds or less. That wraps up our reaction of the latest CFP rankings, and it's shaping up to be an epic finish as we head towards that fateful selection day. Check back on NCAA.com for any updates that you may have missed, and we'll see you next when the final playoff bracket is revealed.